All right, I think we'll go ahead and start our program for today. We promised everyone about an 11:30 start, and it's just a little past that. I'm Nancy Eckerly with the Jasper Chamber, and I'd like to welcome everyone here. In addition, I would like to welcome our guest speaker, who will be giving us the latest economic outlook, including insight on potential emerging trends as we move past COVID and the implications for businesses, especially small businesses. So we have with us today Professor Uric Dufrine. He is with Indiana University Southeast, and I will let him go ahead and give a little background on himself, and then he can move into the program. We are also recording the program, so if everyone would want to, as you currently are, it looks like, keep your computers on mute, and so we don't get any unnecessary background noise. But again, thank you to Uric and then his kind of assistant today, Nicole, who will be going through the slides. And again, she's also recording the program. So thank you so much. We appreciate you being here, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy. Thank you for having me today for the Lunch and Learn. I really appreciate the opportunity to share the latest economic outlook, and I want to welcome all of our guests. We have a great crowd here. Appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to join us for the Lunch and Learn. I also want to thank Nicole in the background, who will be doing the technical details. We had some technical difficulties this morning with sharing my screen, so Nicole's going to be sharing the screen. So thank you, Nicole. So my role, I hold the Sanders Chair in Business at IU Southeast in the School of Business. And part of my role there is to basically follow the local economy. So I spend a lot of time looking at the data for Southern Indiana, for Louisville Metro, Indiana, and also the national economy. And so today, I'm going to provide the latest economic update. And keep in mind now that some of the information that I will share is a certain perspective. It's a perspective that I have right now based on the data that I'm seeing. And it's information that you have that you can then think about how you want to use. There may be some information that could serve as a takeaway for you. Then there might be others where you might say, well, I don't know if this exactly applies to me, but that's okay. And so this is information, my insight that I'm sharing based on the data that I'm seeing right now, and the most recent data that came out this morning that I'm going to share with you. So Nicole, if we can get the data, the PowerPoint, I guess, loaded, and then we'll go ahead and start. All right, thank you so much. So next screen, please. Or next slide, I guess, that's it. Okay, yeah. So what we'll talk about today is we'll talk about the labor market, so where we're headed in terms of jobs and job openings and unemployment claims, and we'll have a discussion about inflation. You know, that's been a big conversation among the pundits, economists, and also households, right? Are these price increases going to be transitory, or will they be more permanent and longer lasting? So we'll try to provide some insight on that. Manufacturing, of course, is very important to Du Bois County in Southern Indiana. The largest sector in Du Bois County and the surrounding region. And so we're going to provide some insight as to what is happening in manufacturing. And then the consumer, of course, drives the U.S. economy, responsible for 2/3 of the U.S. economy. So we're going to talk about what I think is happening with the consumer and how that impacts the outlook. And then we'll sort of give an overall outlook and talk about some of these trends. Along the way, though, I will try to provide some insight as to how I think this could impact business moving forward, particularly small business. So some of the trends that have been emerging, how does that impact my business every day, right? And so we'll try to provide some insight there. And some of this, some of what I'll be talking about with the data will simply validate what you already know. In many cases, we can do that with the graph, right? It simply validates what we already know. But some of it might give you an opportunity for some reflection in terms of how can I use this in my everyday life, but everyday business. Okay, so next slide, please, Nicole. So let's talk about labor market. So what drives the labor markets, of course, is the, and you can, next slide, is overall growth in the economy, right? So this is gross domestic product, and this shows a quarter-over-quarter change and the year-over-year change. So we actually had a report that came out this morning that showed that last blue bar that you see is a lot shorter. It's about 2% growth, and that was somewhat expected. It was actually a little slower than expected. Growth has slowed down, and some of the reasons for this slowdown in growth, of course, I'll talk about later as it relates to labor markets and also some supply chain issues, right? So the labor shortage is producing a bottleneck. I'll talk about that in greater detail later. And also some of these supply chain issues that we continue to experience, that's also impacting growth. But I want to make this point. Now, the 2% growth would not be among the highest, but it's definitely not among the lowest, right? And as I'll discuss later, that this slowdown that we're seeing in the third quarter actually may potentially help alleviate some of these supply chain issues that we're experiencing. So next slide, please. So U.S. non-farm payroll. So this is a strange looking graph because, you know, it shows month over month changes in national jobs. So every first Friday, the U.S. Labor Department of the Bureau of Labor Statistics comes out with the monthly employment report. And the last 2 months were very big disappointments. The market, the consensus was expecting closer to about 500,000 jobs, in some cases higher. And the actual job numbers came in less than 200,000, I think 194,000 last month. And so there were very big disappointments. And the question is, why is that, right? And I'll try to address that. This second bullet point, COVID is the worst thing that happened to graph construction. What I mean by that is, you know, it's very difficult to interpret these, but I wanted you to see this because it shows the magnitude of the job losses that we experienced last year, right? So the big drop, over 20 million. And then we saw a big bounce back. And then we've seen some deceleration in some of those job gains. Again, the last 2 months were very big disappointments. And I think the issue there has to do with the labor force participation and the availability of workers. And I'll share some slides with you on that. So last 2 months were very big disappointments. I do believe, though, that we will begin to see a pickup in job gains in the last quarter and into next year. Today's report, the gross domestic product report, was less than we saw in the second quarter. But I don't think that's going to continue the last quarter and into next year. We should see stronger growth, and I'll talk about why that's the case. So next slide, please. So impact of labor force participation on payroll growth, right? So the last 2 months, as I just mentioned, were very, very weak for job gains, less than expected, a lot less than expected. I think month before last, I think we're expecting closer to a million payrolls, right? And it was much lower than that. If you look at the yellow line, that yellow line shows labor force participation, right? So the percentage of the population in the labor force. And you can see here that we saw a big drop in COVID. That's on the right side, early 2020. We saw the big drop. And then we saw a bounce back. But then we've been sort of stuck. We've been stuck around 61.5% plus or minus, right? Between 61 and 62%. If you look at the gray shaded bar that you see over 2001, and then the gray shaded bar over 2007 to 2009, so these are recessions. The 2001 recession, the Great Recession of 2008. And you can see when you have that drop in labor force participation, you see the blue line also. You see that decline in payrolls, obviously, right? And then you fast forward to the current recession, at least the recession last year, and you do see a bounce back in labor force participation. But then we've been stuck. We've been stuck around between 61 and 62%. So the question is how is this going to impact payroll growth? And I think the last 2 months shows that payroll growth has sort of been stuck, right? And it was the weakest monthly changes that we saw really since the pandemic began, right? Outside of the big losses. So I have a question mark now because it really depends on what happens to that labor force participation. Now, there's a narrative emerging right now that labor force participation may not see significant upward increases. I don't think that's the case. I think it's going to come back up gradually, especially after we go through or after the government stimulus begins to fade. It is fading, but it begins to fade as well. So it's a question mark right now in terms of how this is going to impact payroll growth. But I do believe that the past 2 months, this has certainly resulted in payroll growth that's less than expected. Now, here's the question, though. We've had very weak payroll growth the past 2 months. We have labor force participation that is stuck, but we're also producing more as a nation. So let's go to the next slide, please. So if you look here, a return to pre-recession. So this is payrolls, U.S. payrolls going all the way back to the 1940s. And you can see whenever you have a recession, you see that dip in payrolls, right? You see the last 2 recessions, the 2000 and then the Great Recession. Notice how it took longer to return to pre-recession payrolls. Okay, it took longer to return to pre-recession payrolls. In this case, we have yet to return to pre-recession payrolls. The question is, how long will that take? I'm going to talk about that shortly as to why I think what's happening with this particular graph. Next slide, please, Nicole. So let's look at labor force participation by age. So we take labor force participation, we break it down by age groups. The yellow line is 55 plus, the red line is 16 to 24, and then the blue line is what you call the prime earning years from 25 to 54. And the largest decline is the 55 plus. And there's been a lot of talk about that, right? So with the increase in the equity markets and home values and so forth, homeowners' equity and record changes in the stock market, the 55 plus crowd has been in a position in some cases to be able to retire early. So that may have had an impact, but that is the largest decline is the 55 plus. And some of those numbers may not come back, right? Because these workers may in fact be retired. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is breaking down the labor force participation, male versus female. And you can see that the drop is almost the same, quite similar. So one of the causes with the pandemic has been the availability of childcare, virtual learning, right? So schools not having face-to-face classes, and so that's impacted the opportunity for a parent to maybe to return back to work. In this case here, we see the drop off almost this quite similar. So that could imply that shared parental responsibilities, right, in terms of childcare. But I just wanted to share that with you because it does show that the drop off is almost about the same with respect to labor force participation. Next slide, please. So this is a very interesting graph, right? So this is shows labor force participation by education attainment. And you see the lower skill, that's the yellow line and the green line. So that yellow is less than high school, the green line is high school. And then red is some college and blue is college degree or higher. And you see that the biggest drop off is on the lower skill. So that would be at the high school level being the highest. Less than high school is not as high as a high school. Now, one of the things that we've also seen, I think this reflects this, is that lower skilled groups are actually seeing a greater acceleration in wages and average wages, right? And I think this speaks to that because of the difficulty in hiring at some of the lower skilled levels. So next slide, please. So job openings and unemployed. So we've heard a lot about the number of job openings, right? And the blue line is the number of job openings. I don't have the number of quits. I wanted to add that line, but the number of quits.
A few more up exercises.
Oh, my watch, I don't know if you heard that, but my watch thinks I'm working out right now. It says to start with a few warm-up exercises. So I'm going to finish this. I don't know why I did this, but okay. So the job openings, that's on the blue line, and we have record number of job openings. And job openings now actually exceeds the number of unemployed, right? So we have more openings than the number of unemployed nationwide. And if we had the number of quits, we would also see a record level of quits. We have the highest number of quits. Now that's not necessarily a negative sign. When you see a big acceleration or a big increase in quits like that, that simply means that workers have the confidence that they can find another job. And that's what that reflects, right? So, and the fact that you have more openings than the number of unemployed, that supports the argument that people feel confident that they can quit. And that's why you have the highest number of quits right now. But the second bullet point is it says with GDP growth. So think about that, right? We have the highest number of openings in the history of the series. We have labor force participation that's been stuck. It has not moved above 61.7%, I think. Okay. That's a significant decline from where we were just 5 years ago. But all this is happening at the same time that we're producing more as a nation. We've had GDP growth. Third quarter was slower than expected. But if you look at GDP now compared to prior to the recession, it's higher. So why is that? What's happened? Let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so when we add the yellow line, that this is actually real GDP, and real GDP is actually higher, slightly higher than where we were prior to the pandemic. If you look at nominal GDP, which is not adjusted for inflation, it's higher. Okay, so we have produced more as a nation now compared to prior to the pandemic, but we've done so with the record number of job openings, and also a decline in the size of not only the labor force participation rate, but also the size of the labor force. So the size of the labor force is lower now. In fact, the last employment report that came out, the reason why I was not as concerned about the job gains, that was a weak number. That was a weak number because of the losses in local education, local and state education, right? So that was a weak number. And there may have been some concerns about how that number was adjusted seasonally with everything happening last year with the pandemic and virtual learning. And then fast forwarding to this year, that may have impacted some of the seasonality, okay? But the weak part, my concern about the last employment report was on what's called a household survey on the side. And that was with the labor force. The labor force actually declined last month. Okay, we actually saw a reduction in the labor force. That's more concerning than the payroll number at this point. So if we look at this graph here, again, labor force is down, labor force participation is down, openings are up, but we've produced the highest, well, we're producing more as a country now than prior to the pandemic. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what is this showing? So when we add productivity, okay, so output per input, output per hour, let's look at it that way. When you look at some of these declines, and you look at in the Great Recession, you saw a big drop off in labor participation, but you saw some increases in productivity. You see the same thing here. if you look at now, in fact, we have a greater reduction in labor force participation, but we're seeing gains to productivity. In fact, we're seeing significant gains to productivity. If you look at that change in productivity, and I can't give you the precise estimate, I've looked at this before, but that change from the pre-pandemic to now, that gap, that magnitude, that jump, okay, it's among the highest that we've seen. So what's happening? Well, this is what's happening, right? As you know, when you're producing a good or you're selling a service, and you cannot hire someone when there's a vacancy, you figure out how to get it done, right? So if you have 5 on the line, but now you only have 3, you make it work, right? You use creativity to make the product, to produce that good or service with fewer people. You might also invest in automation. You might invest in software. Capital expenditures right now, we're seeing big increases in capital expenditures. A lot of that is driving these gains to productivity. One of the reasons why it's taking longer, and this is going back, if you remember the graph we had that showed it's taking longer now to recover jobs. And remember the talk about a jobless recovery, right? That started in the 1990 recession, 2001, 2007, the Great Recession. It took a long time to recover all those lost jobs. I don't think it's going to take as long this time here because this is a different type of recession. But what's happening there is employers are relying more on innovations, capital investment to replace labor. And I think we're going to see more of that this time because the labor is not there, the labor scarcity situation. And that is driving automation, that's driving creativity, and that's one of the reasons why you're seeing these gains to productivity at the same time that we have a smaller labor force. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so some key takeaways here. The nationwide labor shortage is having an impact on job growth. So I like to say this sometimes, that if you want to hire someone, you have a job vacancy, but there's no one to fill the position, you have not created the job. So this is definitely having an impact not only on job growth, but we saw in the GDP growth report today, having an impact on the ability of the economy to produce. Productivity increases. So what's happening here? Well, I think we can expect some additional productivity gains. It takes a while to convert from labor to capital. You can't just flip a switch, right? It takes time to do that in terms of installing the equipment, dealing with vendors, all of that, right? But I believe that these shortages that we're seeing, labor shortages, will motivate technology and automation investments. I was talking with someone here, actually at the Harvest Homecoming Festival, ran into a colleague, and his wife was also there, and we were talking, having a conversation. And she works for a software firm, software engineering, where they do software, right? And they work a lot of their customers are in supply chain, logistics, warehouses. And she was telling me that they are absolutely slammed. They're extremely busy. They're slammed with business right now. And that's what this second bullet point is all about. Companies will have no choice but to rely more on technology and automation. I was attending a football game this past weekend. LSU Ole Miss, actually, University of Mississippi and LSU game in Oxford, Mississippi. And there was in Oxford, Mississippi, a robot, get this, a robot rolling through the streets of Oxford. The robot, it was a little car, was carrying food. It was doing food deliveries. Now, whoever would have thought that, right? But there was a car on the side, actually using the sidewalk, taking food to a customer. This is automation in action. We're seeing technology and automation investments. And I think now, again, this is nothing new, right? We've been seeing this for quite some time. but the impact of COVID will be to accelerate some of these investments. Potential structural changes in labor participation by skill levels. So what's happening as we replace some of this labor with equipment, that is going to result in some structural changes by skill levels. I think some of the, you saw the big drop off in the lower skill levels. That could result in some structural, these automation and technological investments can result in structural changes in some of the labor participation by skill levels. So the dominant revisions that we saw to GDP and that we saw today will help ease, I think, some of these supply chain challenges, right? It's going to give manufacturers a chance to catch up. So this is going to impact small business especially, and that is the changing dynamics in labor markets due to remote work arrangements. Businesses may have to be more flexible on this, and the market might dictate that, right? We have, and now in all cases, that may not be possible. It's just not doable for someone to work remotely. But when employees now have choices because of this labor shortage, that the ability to work remotely can either be a competitive advantage or a constraint on the ability of a business to fill vacant positions. Small business will have to compete in this tighter labor market environment. And so that means how we view recruitment, how we view training and development, a lot of that will have to change, and productivity will be key. In some cases, we may not be able to fill those positions, and that's where the productivity will come in. And certainly nationwide, we're seeing big gains to productivity. So next slide, please. So let's quickly run through some of these unemployment claims. Next slide. In the Great Recession, we saw a big spike in unemployment claims, and then it took 6 years to return to the pre-recession level. Again, this was a different recession. 2007 was a financial crisis. This was not a financial crisis. Next slide. This is the latest this morning was. I think it came in at 280 something thousand. So we're getting close. We're getting close to these pre-pandemic levels. So we had a big drop, and now we're down 95+%. If I update it with the numbers this morning, it might be maybe 96% drop in claims since April 2020. So we had a big peak, and we've been declining ever since, right? And we sort of had a little increase back last year when we saw that wave last year in the coronavirus, but it's been coming down since. Next slide, please. Also with Indiana and Kentucky, we see significant declines in unemployment claims as well. Next slide. I don't know if you can see here, but this shows sort of the numbers by county, and you can see the counties in southern Indiana are significantly lower now compared, actually slightly elevated compared to February 2020. But if we had numbers that, I don't have the April 2020 slide, but you would see that the unemployment claims have come down significantly compared to where we were last year. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is for DuBois County. So this has 3 lines. It looks like a messy graph, but I just want to talk about what these 3 lines mean. So the blue line is unemployment. So the number of unemployed in DuBois County, and looks like about 500 right now. And then you see employment shooting up, right? That's the red line. And then you see the labor force. You see, as in all cases nationwide and also across Indiana, you see this drop off in the labor force, and then you see a resurgence of the labor force, and then it's been sort of like stuck, right? And if you notice how the decline in that labor force has had an impact on employment as well. So I've got another slide shortly that shows the number of job openings. And in DuBois County, there's been a significant increase in the number of job openings. And you can see here how that is impacting employment. DuBois is not alike. Is not alone here. the labor force is just not available to fill some of those openings. And that is causing employment growth to be sort of stuck right now, as we saw nationwide with the last job report. So let's go to the next slide, please. So yeah, this is incredible here. Now the graphs, the bars, that's how Excel does the graph. Okay, so it sort of emphasizes the higher number. But if you look at on the left side, okay, these are job postings in Du Bois County, and you see February 2020 we had a little more than 200 job postings, and I'll show you what those occupations were shortly. And then that second bar, notice it goes up over 600. So we've had a tripling of job postings in Du Bois County. So there are lots of job openings right now, three times the level that existed back in February 2020 before the shutdowns. And then if you look at the labor force, right? Labor force, February 2020, about 23,000 labor force. And then now this is Du Bois County specific. This does not consider residents or commuters that come to Du Bois to work. Okay, these are only Du Bois County residents here. But then you can see here in 2021 October, right? There's been a drop off. Now this graph is deceiving, right? We have not had a 50% reduction in the labor force. If you look at the 2020, you've got about 23,000. And we're down about 22.6 right now. So a decline of about 400 or 500 labor force, but then we've had an increase in job postings by about 300, right? Actually 400. So think about that, right? We've had an increase in job postings by about 400 postings, 400 openings, an increase, and we've had a decline in the labor force by about 400. Okay, so that tells you why we're having a hard time filling these job openings. Next slide, please. Yeah, so what are the occupations, right? So these are by occupation, and you can see here on the left side in February, this is going back to February 2020. You see personal care aid, so home, I guess that's in home health care. And I don't know if you all would know this, if Du Bois, because I was seeing that also last year, if Du Bois County, I think probably that Du Bois County may have some companies, one or two maybe in the home health care industry perhaps. And but last year they were definitely hiring. And you see some other positions, customer service representatives, first line supervisors, and so forth. You see truck drivers way down to about fifth, I guess, right? And yes, Nancy? Okay.
Oh, I was just going to comment that there are many home health care agencies located in Jasper, and also some that serve our area, but there's many of them located here. And then you were going on to truck drivers. Many companies here do hire truck drivers and are very much in need of those right now.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yes. So last year, the home health care companies were the highest number of occupations were in the home health care area. If we fast forward to 2021 October, you can see here, as Nancy just mentioned, and this is not unique to Du Bois County. We're seeing this in the 5 counties in Louisville Metro as well. Although locally here in Louisville Metro, we're seeing registered nurses being the highest, but you can see here nurses and truck drivers are almost neck and neck, right? And then you see some nursing assistants, some retail, some insurance, and so forth. But I think the fact that we have such a high number of openings in the truck driving positions, I think that speaks to some of the supply chain logistics that we're seeing, right? So if you can get the goods off, if you have room at the port to get the goods off the ship, well, then you need a tractor trailer, right, to move the goods from the port, assuming you have space to keep it on the dock there, right, to move it into a warehouse. But you need a tractor trailer to do that. And then if you get it to the warehouse, you then need a truck to move it right out to another location. So this is causing ripple effects throughout the economy. And that's why I think you're seeing weaker payroll numbers nationally. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what are some key takeaways? So these labor shortages will continue to serve as a bottleneck of the economy. I do think that we'll continue to see a decline in unemployment claims. In terms of small business implications, significant implications for recruitment, right? So small businesses are going to have to look at opportunities such as remote work. I think it's important that small businesses be able to provide recruits and prospective employees some opportunities for advancement, right, at all levels. So what will I be doing in 5 years if I go to work for you, right? And being able to show that, well, if you start now, in 5 years, if you do this, this, and this, you'll be at this level, right? Small business, we've got to look at talent, not just small business, all business, talent pipelines. How are we cultivating our talent? How are we working with the local schools, K-12, post-secondary, to develop these talent pipelines, internships, co-ops, apprenticeships, what have you? It's no longer, right? You can no longer just put an ad in the paper or a job site and expect there to be lots of applicants. That's not always the case. And so it's important that you consider all these opportunities for prospective employees and being able to talk about that. Training and development. What are we going to do to train you, to develop you, right? So how can I develop as an employee if I come to work for you? Of course, compensation is not just about compensation, but it's also about the benefits piece as well. So these are all implications for small business, I think, as we deal with this labor shortage that we're dealing with right now. Next slide, please. Okay, let's quickly go through some of these. Next slide, Du Bois County. So these are the change in jobs. So this is just for Du Bois County. And you can see we're down about 1,400 jobs now compared to the first quarter 2020. And this is, now in the bottom of the shutdowns, I guess, right, or the bottom of the recession. This would be the first quarter to second quarter, I think. You can see we're down almost 2,000. So we've come off some of that. And this looks very similar to what we see in other regions as well. Now, some of these jobs, though, because of, well, let me talk about this later when I get to the manufacturing slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so where are these job losses? You can see here that now this is Du Bois County from 2020 first quarter to 2021 first quarter, and you can see a drop off in manufacturing, right? In fact, more than half of those job losses are now located in manufacturing, and you see some smaller losses in other sectors. But these manufacturing jobs will come back, but it's going to be very slow. And some of these jobs may not come back because of, again, technology investments, automation. And as a result, and I'll talk about this later, there's going to be a greater demand for skilled employees, right? So we were talking about this before the recession, before the pandemic, about the availability of skilled labor. I think with COVID, it's simply going to, again, accelerate that because of the reliance on automation, or moving more towards automation and technological investment. So the big drop off is in manufacturing, but it does not mean that manufacturers are not growing right now, right? We can grow, we can meet demand, but we can do so with fewer employees because we're more productive. Next slide, please. So the change in average weekly wages, there was sort of this increase in early 2020, and you see that with that second to last bar. That was this was the last quarter of 2020, and then you see a decline in 2021 compared to the first quarter of 2020. Okay, now this graph is not showing it, but I think we can probably expect to see additional increases in the average weekly wages. the 5 counties in southern Indiana, the graph does not look exactly like this. There was a big increase last year. In fact, the largest increase that we've seen in the history of the series. And we're seeing this as well right now. It's not the largest increase. It looks like it's the second largest increase in the last quarter, 2020. And then we came down a little bit in early 2021. But, once wages increase, it's very difficult for an employer to reduce wages, right? The wage increases tend to be sticky. And how are we going to make up for those increases in wages? That's going to come through the productivity that I've been talking about. So one of the reasons why why equity markets have been doing quite well in October is because earnings reports are coming out and companies are beating earnings estimates. They're beating profit expectations, right? This is at the same time during a labor scarcity, labor shortage, right? Well, why? Because these companies are seeing gains. Please. Yeah, total wages. This simply shows the change in total wages, and you're seeing again an increase in late 2020 and then a drop off in 2021. And I think this is a reflection of the decline in the manufacturing jobs, right? The fact that manufacturing jobs down by 800 over the recession. Manufacturing being some of the highest paid jobs. That's why this is showing a decline. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are some key takeaways? And then we're going to wrap up. We've got 2 more. We've got I want to go through manufacturing and then the consumer, and then we're going to have to go a little faster through those 2. So what are some takeaways? So upward pressure on average weekly wages. That will continue. Labor shortages. What happens with these labor shortages? Well, it's a question about capital versus labor. And in some cases, employers will be forced to rely on capital. And so I think you're going to have a greater polarization in skilled versus unskilled. Skilled is going to be very important. So when you're talking about a new machine, maybe someone has to program that new machine, right? Skilled versus unskilled. And this matching of skill supply with jobs demand will become just as, in fact, more important post-COVID as it was prior to COVID. As a result, the competitive landscape for small business will only intensify. And these higher wages. So how do we meet these higher wages? What happens? Well, there are several routes, right? One is lower profits. A business might be forced to take on lower profits if they can't pass on those higher prices to the customers. Another way is through greater productivity, right? So we can afford to meet those higher wages if we see productive increases. And all that is a function of what industry you're in, right? What business you're in, the goods or services. But that non-price competition is critical, especially at the small business level. So if you're looking at higher wages, you can't necessarily pass on higher prices to customers. That non-price competition is absolutely critical in terms of the service you provide, right? Hours of open, all those non-price factors become even more important for a small business if they're unable to pass along those price increases to customers. And of course, customer retention becomes a very key strategy as a business strategy, right? And then on the employee recruitment and retention side, that becomes even more competitive. And so you've got to look at all sorts of strategies to be competitive along that job front. And that includes some of this remote work that we've been talking about. So next slide, please. So let's quickly go through inflation. This is the 10-year yield, which has an inflationary component. And, we saw, of course, big declines, and then we saw an increase and a decline, and it's been a resurging once again. We're up to about 1.65. But, you can just look here compared to previous years, we're still significantly lower where we were leading into the Great Recession. And so this here is not pricing in a big inflation component at this time. So next slide, please. If you look at the survey of professional forecasters, they're showing inflation closer to 2.5, about 2.4%. And they're pretty accurate, actually. Next slide, please. When we add CPI you can see that the professional forecasters, their forecasts are tracks closely with CPI. Next slide. They're close to about, again, 2 point something percent. Now, this is, I call it a market implied forecast of inflation, because if we look at the difference between what's called a Treasury inflationary protected security and the Treasury rate, we can see that it's close. It's again about 2.88% right now, right? This is over 5 years. So this is higher. This is higher than we've seen in the past, okay? But it's also consistent with the Fed wanting to, if you recall, the Fed wanting to overshoot inflation so that the average would sort of be anchored, I guess, right? So, but there's still a lot of uncertainty with this, with inflation. And to be honest with you, I think a lot of people are still, there's a question mark. So next slide, please. Yeah, so when you add CPI, you can see that the market implied inflation does not always agree with the CPI estimate, CPI numbers, right? It's not always accurate. So next slide. We've had some deceleration, and earlier this year, the used car and trucks were a big component of the price increases, and that's come down just a little bit, not that much. And then next slide, please. And then the CPI, when you take away food and energy, I guess as long as you don't need gasoline and you don't need food, we're okay, right? But if you take away food and energy, which tend to be more volatile, that's also come down a little bit, but still elevated compared to previous years. So next slide. So, you know, it's the first bullet point when I say expect price increases to stabilize, the question is how long it takes to do that. Right. And that all depends on that second bullet point, the supply chain kinks that we're seeing right now. But there's still, excuse me, a lot of uncertainty and a lot of debate around this. And but at some point, and again, when is at some point? I think all these other forces that were causing prices to be price increases to be well contained, such as globalization, I call it the Amazon effect, and aging demographics, which tend to result more in deflationary environments, right? All that is going to come back at some point, but the question is when that is. And you know, this past week, I think Jerome Powell, the head of the Fed, said that may take longer now than it previously expected. Next slide, please. Let's quickly go through some of these. So the ISM has been very positive. This is simply a monthly survey of purchasing managers. We saw some of the highest levels since the 80s. That's come down somewhat, but we're still well over 60, which is very positive for manufacturing. Next slide, please. Why is that? Well, because this is messy, but just look at on the far right of the graph, the blue and the gold lines. These are backlog and new orders. So high in new orders, high in backlogs. Inventory has come up somewhat, right? But inventories are still down relative to previous years. And so that means that it's going to take us some time to get through all this production. We've got more production to take care of these new orders and the backlog of orders, and also to replenish inventories. Next slide, please. Yeah, so these are custom inventories in the ISM survey. And you can see, again, that's come up, but we're at record low levels, right? So again, it's going to take us some time to replenish these inventories, which means production. Next slide. So yes, I'm still expecting growth in manufacturing. And now again, that second bullet point, manufacturing growth does not always transfer to growth in manufacturing jobs, because sometimes we're able to produce more with automation and technology. And that may be happening right now with some manufacturers. And the question is, will labor constraints accelerate the use of more capital? I think that's happening. And it's showing that in capital expenditures being very high. And again, just anecdotal evidence when talking to the software engineer where they're slammed with business right now. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the consumer for just a bit and we'll wrap up. So we've seen some dampening consumer confidence, and I think that has a lot to do with the surge in the Delta variant. I think a lot of it is, to be honest with you, with the how can I describe this with the political environment? I think that leads to a dampening consumer confidence. I think moving past the government stimulus phase, and I think that can have an impact as well. And I think that's going to impact consumer behavior, because when it's there's a difference how you spend money when it's through earnings versus transfer payments, right? In terms of your consumer behavior. And but yeah, so dampening consumer confidence, but I'm still quite optimistic with the consumer. And let's go to the next slide, please, as to why I think that's the case. So stimulus has produced record-breaking changes in income. Now that's not going to be sustained, right? And you can see the bottom line here, the personal consumption expenditures. So how much we spend, you see that's been a big uptick, right? Well, how is consumer behavior impacted as stimulus fades? I think consumers behave differently when you're spending money from your own paycheck versus, again, a transfer payment that you receive in the mail. Your behavior is different, and but I'll talk about that shortly as to how I think that will impact consumer behavior. Okay, next slide, please. So we've had record savings, right? Big increase in savings. We're lower now. We're just under 10% in the savings rate. But even at that rate, it's still elevated compared to previous years, okay? But this savings is going to serve as a reserve for future spending. At some point, those rates will also come down, supporting consumer spending. Next slide, please. Household net worth. So back in the Great Recession, we saw a decline. As the recession, if you see over 2007, as we entered the recession, net worth was declining because of declining home values, right? The stock market, of course, had declined significantly. In this recession, we're seeing nothing like that. Yes, we did see a little drop off in the first quarter of 2020, because you had a big chunk of the equity markets were removed, right? But of course, that's bounced back. And we're now seeing the highest level ever in household net worth. Again, supported by equity markets, supported by home values. That's one of the reasons why you see the 55 plus in the labor market, right? Why you see a big drop off in the 55 plus, because of this here. But this looks nothing like we saw in the Great Recession. So next slide, please. So we're also seeing personal debt ratio reclining. Now, consumers are beginning to use credit cards again, but the personal debt ratio, debt as a percentage of income, that's been declining. And you can see it's been declining ever since really the Great Recession, actually, right? Next slide, please. Retail sales. In the Great Recession, it took 4 years for us to hit the pre-recession level. This time, we did it in just a few months. And in fact, look at the change in retail sales. We've never seen an increase of that magnitude in retail sales. One of the reasons why, right, we're seeing some of these supply chain problems. Next slide, please. And yeah, I just wanted to show this. This shows month over month. Actually, no, this shows the percentage year over year, the percentage over the year. And you can see here, it's been the highest that we see going back to 1992. And then next slide, please. Yeah, so some key takeaways. Consumers have more money to spend. And I've been very optimistic about the consumer. I don't think the consumer is going to go away right now, even though we're moving past the stimulus phase. Now, here's what's happening, I think. The current supply chain issues will provide a boost to subsequent demand. What do I mean by that? Well, I have a car that has, right now, I'm approaching 130,000 miles on it. But, I could probably use another vehicle. I'm going to hold on to it as long as I can. One of the reasons why is because I don't want to deal with all the issues right now, right? And so every day I'm adding more miles to my car but I'm not wanting to buy because of these supply chain issues, right? I prefer going to a lot, having vehicles on the lot, right? So I can see, so I can open the door, that type of thing, right? And apply this to many other goods out there right now where consumers are deciding to hold off because of some of these supply chain issues. So in an odd way, what we're seeing right now will also provide a subsequent boost for demand. But long term, I do believe that we're going to see overall a more cautious consumer moving forward, and because I think many households are saying right now, I don't want this to happen again, right? So I think that's going to impact consumer behavior moving forward, but we're not at that point yet. The next slide, please, and we'll wrap up here. Yeah, just quickly, Nicole, thank you. Yeah, so this shows employment by education attainment, and I think it's an amazing graph. The red is at the bachelor's degree, blue is at the high school level, and yellow is some college and associate's degree. And you can see since the 2001 recession, the blue line has been declining ever since. The red line's been increasing, and the yellow line has shown some increases, but not as much. So again, for Indiana as a state, the importance of education attainment. In the next slide, and we'll just wrap up here. Yeah, so just overall outlook, we can expect job losses to decline. I think we should see a hiring. We'll have more employees coming back to the job market. Inflation is too early. Well, in May, I was saying it was too early to tell, but now I think it's lots of uncertainty, I think. But I still think at some point we'll see a moderation in some of these prices. Expect solid growth in manufacturing. Next slide, please. And I've already talked about all this in terms of the competitive landscape for small business, greater emphasis on skills, training, and education. And then last slide, back in May, this was in May, but I'm still maintaining this position, was expecting a V-shaped recovery. And this could apply to GDP, employment growth, but then moving forward at some point, we'll see more moderation in growth. And that's because of changes to the consumer in terms of being more cautious and frugality. So, okay, I think we're right up on an hour, Nancy. So I appreciate the time and appreciate everyone remaining with us. And I don't know how much time we have, Nancy. I'll turn it over to you there.
We're really right at the time. I guess if we wanted to entertain a few questions, we could. So if anyone has a question, please unmute and just kind of shout out your question. Okay, we'll just give that a few seconds, but I don't see anyone doing that. So, Uric, I think we'll just go ahead and wrap up. Lots of really, really great information, lots of great statistics. And we'll do this again sometime, perhaps early spring, and we'll see once what the future evolves into based on some of your economic outlook and your information you shared today.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy, and everyone. Again, thank you all, and it's been great. Looking forward to coming to Jasper. I love Jasper. It's one of my favorite towns in Southern Indiana. And Nancy, again, thank you so much, and I hope to see you all soon. So thank you.
I think we'll do the next one in person. So thank you so much.
That'd be great. Thank you. Okay,
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.